Well, apparently, for almost a whole year now, one of the big issues in the gaming community has been sexism. No, really. Fuck the fact that the whole industry might be tanking. No, you see, sexism is the real issue here. And we can all thank Anita Sarkeesian, also known as Feminist Frequency, for helping us realize this. Or rather, we could if she bothered to really go into depth about why anyone should give a flying fuck about fictional females being disempowered. Sexism is one of those things that is hard to understand, mainly due to how opinionated it is. Yes, to those of you who think that sexism in itself exists in a vacuum, that simply isn't the case. What is sexism to some isn't sexism to others. This leads us to the topic of Anita's first Tropes versus Women in Video Games lecture, because that's what it fucking was, and my thoughts on this little fiasco. Now, I'm just going to assume that everyone watching this video already knows who she is, so I'm not going to waste time explaining it. Just Google Feminist Frequency to get up to speed. What I'm going to focus on is the multiple perspectives of which the Damsel in Distress trope that Anita claims is harmful to women can be viewed as, and ultimately hope to actually encourage people to think about the trope's meaning and usage, as opposed to just pointing out a trope everyone already knew was overused and making fairly weak accusations that are based on Jean Grey levels of telepathy. Let's start off with the first issue I have with her video, Dinosaur Planet. I probably shouldn't even bother mentioning that the other playable character, Saber, is male, and that Star Fox basically replaces Saber as he is no longer in the game when it becomes Star Fox Adventures. What I'm curious to know is why Anita conveniently chose to edit Crystal's introduction to General Skills, as there is something truly thought-provoking when you consider what that full scene was like.
The sharp claw tribe. And who might you be, animal girl?
My name is Crystal, and I've come for the princess.
You seem a long way from home. Crystal, I can't believe the wizard asked a girl to do his dirty work.
How do you know the wizard?
Let's just say we had a nice little chat, and he's agreed to take a rest for a while. At least until I've taken over the planet.
You coward, Scales. My mother will send an army against you.
Ah, yes, Princess Kite. Your mother. Once I've dealt with this animal, then we'll pay your mother a visit. That's a nice try. But you'll have to kill me before you can save the princess.
My name is Crystal, and I'm here for the princess. What princess is she talking about? Well, if you bother to look at the first hour of gameplay for Dinosaur Planet, available for free, not for $6,000 on YouTube, the princess being referred to is Princess Kite, or something like that. Her exact name isn't important. What's important is that the very same game with this strong and capable female lead literally starts off using the same Damsel in Distress trope. No, really, this shit happens within the first 5 minutes of the damn game. My question is this trope still offensive? Think about it. We have a female character being reduced to an object, as Anita would put it, and the only real difference is that a woman is charged with saving her. Of course, most of you familiar with Anita's video know that her beef isn't with Dinosaur Planet, it's with Star Fox Adventures. Well, for starters, this same opening scene is in Adventures as well. The only difference is being that there is no longer this wizard involved with the plot, and the princess is replaced with a distress signal. This distress signal turns out to be coming from a bunch of dying dinosaurs, so basically they need saving too. The only major difference in the two scenes is that General Scales is originally struck down with lightning, which allows Crystal to take control of the ship, while in Adventures, Crystal is thrown overboard but escapes, proceeding to free the Krauzow spirits. Speaking of which, the way Anita talks about Adventures, you'd think that Crystal wasn't playable at the start of the game, when she in fact is. Now, it is worth noting that Crystal fails after releasing the first Krauser spirit and is then trapped in Crystal by Andros in order to use her to resurrect himself. This is when the game switches to Star Fox, who replaces both Crystal and the scrapped character Saber as the only playable protagonist. In Dinosaur Planet, it can be assumed that Crystal takes a larger role as she not only fights Galdon, but also has to take the test of fear, all of these being things that Star Fox does in Adventures instead of Crystal. The funny thing here, though, is that this highlights an issue with Anita's argument. Originally, Crystal was tasked with saving a princess herself, and even freed some captives in the prison breakout scene, which now features Fox instead. If disempowerment is a form of justification, what does this make Princess Kite and all the other people Crystal was expected to help? Hell, even the Crystal in Adventures was answering a distress call, and once saved by Fox, she goes right back to shooting Astronauts with her staff. With Crystal basically doing everything Fox ended up doing in Dinosaur Planet, there's no wondering as to why Anita chose Crystal to open her video with. She was indeed strong and capable, and she was basically the same kind of character that Saber would have been. In a sense, she was exactly that in Star Fox Adventures, or rather she would have been if Andros didn't stop her at the beginning of her own adventure. As many things that can be debated over the unfinished Dinosaur Planet, one thing that Anita makes sure that everyone recognizes is Crystal's new sexualized look in Star Fox Adventures.
In this revamped version, the would-be protagonist Crystal has been transformed into a damsel in distress and spends the vast majority of the game trapped inside a crystal prison, waiting to be rescued by the new hero Fox McCloud. The in-game action sequences that were originally built for Crystal were converted to feature Fox instead. Crystal is given a skimpier, more sexualized outfit.
Wow, she's beautiful. What am I doing?
And yes, that is cheesy saxophone music playing to make sure it's crystal clear that she is now an object of desire, even while in suspended animation. To add insult to injury, Fox is now using her magical staff to fight his way through the game to save her. The tale of how Crystal went from protagonist of her own epic adventure to the passive victim in someone else's game illustrates how the damsel in distress trope disempowers female characters and robs them of the chance to be heroes in their own right.
For the record, the wiki pages for Crystal refer to her as a vixen, so the sexualization can't really be argued against. The point that Anita is apparently trying to make is that now that Crystal is both helpless and sexualized, she's essentially become an object of desire, a prize to be won, nothing more than a mere trophy, if you will. Of course, this is the only incentive Fox would need to save someone like Crystal, right? He sees a beautiful woman encased in a crystal prison and proceeds to set her free, probably because he just wanted to fuck her, right? See, this implication that the player's incentive is purely sexual is kind of, well, weird. I'd say it's reverse sexism, but really, it just comes off as paranoid. To be fair to Anita, she never outright says that the player themselves, as in the gamers, see the helpless damsel as a prize, but if we didn't see them as a prize, then why even mention this? Who exactly sees women in danger as objects? The characters in the games risking their lives to save them? Somehow I doubt that's the case. Keep in mind that in Star Fox Adventures, Fox McCloud fights armies of Sharpclaws, gets eaten alive by Galdon, and endures various trials in order to retrieve the rest of the Krauser spirits, actions that ultimately saved Dinosaur Planet from both General Scales and Andros, yet I'm expected to believe that all of this is supposedly happening because the player wants to win Crystal. It's shit like this that helps to push negative thoughts on chivalry. I can understand not wanting to be treated like a child, but something is fucking wrong when the sheer act of helping women specifically who just happen to not be able to help themselves is seen as offensive. Let's go deeper into why this idea is so ridiculous, but first let's address the one relevant thing that Anita brings up in her ramblings about French and the origin of the word damsel, as if that actually supports her point. Guess what? It really doesn't. Anyway, when Anita starts talking about medieval folklore, one thing she states sticks out like a herniated disc. The saving of defenseless women was often portrayed as insert meaningless friends, or rather for the or reason for existence in romance tales and poems of the era. So basically, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the only reason for existence is to apparently save pretty women. It's kind of funny how the whole point of these knight errands was to prove one's virtue and dignity by rescuing women, as opposed to beating them to death, was considered the best way to do this. I was under the impression that protecting women was a good thing, but it's not like Anita doesn't hint as to why this idea is somehow harmful, as she does argue that the chivalrous trope encourages toxic, patronizing, and paternalistic attitudes towards women. Out of all the words Anita uses to describe the horrible side effects of this trope, the one that sticks out the most are patronizing and paternalistic. Yeah, toxic is bad too, I guess, but that word doesn't mean shit unless you can explain why it should be applied. Patronizing and paternalistic, however, have some pretty fucking heavy implications to them. Basically, she thinks the trope is bad because it undermines women's capabilities. In other words, the women in question have no more control over their own safety as a child. Seriously, why use the words patronizing and then follow it up with paternalistic unless we're talking about fucking babies? I would prefer to make an entirely separate video regarding my views on feminist theory and feminists themselves, so I'll make this brief, but while I'm on the topic, I want to point something out here. We all know about the dreaded patriarchy that, despite female leaders not being anything new, apparently robbed women of any kind of agency or influence in most countries. In other words, women were reduced to children and treated as such. I think this correlation between women and children and the social construct that both groups need protection, hence phrases like women and children first that lump the two together, gets ignored far too often. I say this because if most of women's oppression can basically be compared to treatment of children, you could argue that children are naturally oppressed by default, which means everyone has been oppressed at least once in their lives. I'll elaborate on what that means in another video. For now, I want to focus on Anita's assertion that wanting to protect women is somehow demeaning to them and objectifies them in a supposedly sexual way at the same time. Yes, before anyone mentions it, I'm well aware of BDSM. The point here is that if a male hero goes out of his way to save a woman in need of help, he is somehow objectifying her by not letting her save herself. Something that, let's be brutally honest here, women aren't really expected to do in real life. I'm still fairly new to all this rape culture shit, but one video of a woman named Cheska recalling her rape experiences reinforces what I'm apparently expected to believe is a sexist stereotype.
It's really great that Jenna touched on the idea of looking out for one another. If you see a woman that is in a potentially dangerous situation at a bar or what have you, there's no reason that you can't step in and try to help her out. But what I would add to that is it shouldn't just be a woman's responsibility to look out for other women. There's no reason that a guy can't step in at a bar and say like, hey dude, this girl is wasted. I don't think she wants to go home with you. Let's put her in a cab.
Okay, so let me get this straight. If I'm at a bar and I see some guys harassing a woman, guys who might possibly rape her, I should do the right thing and intervene, right? It's only fair to note that the woman in the video does specify that women can help fight against rape simply by looking out for each other. For the record, she also acknowledges that men can be raped as well. However, and maybe it's the tone of the video that's throwing me off here, but the actual action of confronting the assailant and taking the woman to safety isn't really what women are expected to do. She's asking men to do that part. Not only that, but the objectified woman in this scenario is incapable of saving herself due to drunkenness in this particular case, which I guess means she's being disempowered. It's also worth pointing out that the assailant in her examples is assumed to be male while the victim is assumed to be female. This may sound like a sexist stereotype aimed at men, and I'd argue that this heavy implication that women can never rape is ignored a little too often, but the facts do support this assertion. I'm not going to bore you with the statistics, so I'll just leave the info into the video description. But women apparently get raped more often than men do. If you want to get technical, children and young adults get raped more than any other demographic. Of course, when looking at the stats, it can be assumed that if you are ever raped, your assailant is most likely male on top of that. Hence the whole teach men not to rape shit because women are somehow capable of being rapists. It's also worth noting that the definition of rape had to be revised to even include men, so technically men who were victims of rape were even considered to be rape victims, but that's besides the point. What does rape have to do with Damsels in Distress? Well, here's the thing. If you actually consider the context of most of the examples Anita used in her argument, you can basically view most of the stories as being of a man protecting a woman from either death or rape. For example, Popeye's Bluto was often shown to be attacking Olive Oyl with undoubtedly sexual intentions.
Now that we're alone, Cookie, how about getting Amoroso to this virtuoso with a kiss-em-up? Come on, babe. Don't be flat. Be natural.
You, keep your hands to you.
Folks, let's be real here. Blue was a fucking sex offender. What he was doing to Olive Oyl in practically every Popeye episode can be considered sexual assault without the slightest hint of sarcasm. For Popeye himself to bother stepping in to protect Olive from Bluto is essentially encouraging two ideas: that women can't defend themselves and that men should stand up for them because of this. Hence the constant encouragement for men to man up and act as guardians of their women. Because, women are property. No man ever protects their girlfriends and wives out of love, obviously. So when I say things like my mother or my sister, I'm talking about my property, of course. Sarcasm aside, this damsel in distress trope can also be looked at as the white knight trope. For every damsel in distress, there's some chivalrous hero who apparently made the objectifying choice to protect the people he cares about as opposed to letting them solve their own problems. Going back to the rape example for a second, the woman in that clip was encouraging men to step up and protect women. According to her, there is no reason for men not to do this, as opposed to Anita's argument that doing so, at least in fiction, is some form of objectification. So, with that in mind, why can't the women protect themselves? Since I'd be objectifying them if I bothered to not be a total asshole and actually intervene when it's sexual assault. This isn't rare, mind you. There was that cross-assault shit with Superyan who was sexually assaulted, or rather sniffed, because that's all that actually happened, by her coach, Eris. The response was, of course, to point out how much of a douche Eris was being, something that shouldn't be surprising considering the state of the FGC, and to basically rush in on horseback in shining armor to defend her. The actual video itself, available here on YouTube and linked in the description, doesn't show Superyan actually standing up for herself. This is because she didn't, by the way. Then there's the constant reminders of how women get treated online, despite the fact that being male doesn't protect you from death or rape threats by any means, through articles on gaming websites. One of the most noticeable being about ganking from some random YouTube user named Shrine and I. Because, Kotaku totally isn't pushing citizens' content themselves. The message radiating from these types of incidents have been rather consistent in relating two particular themes. That women get harassed by men, never the other way around, and men in particular need to work towards making the gaming community, or any community for that matter, safe for them. And two, that anybody encouraging women to simply tough out their own shit is somehow missing the point or promoting misogyny, because apparently expecting women who happen to be grown-ass adults to be capable of protecting themselves is wrong. Now, I just want to clarify that I am in no way condoning the sexual harassment or overall vile treatment of women in these examples, nor am I saying that things like rape and sexual assault shouldn't be taken seriously. They should. However, considering that the basis of Anita's argument about the damsel in distress trope is that it displays women as being incapable of solving their own problems, it would be nice if there wasn't a real-life deviation of feminism manifesting itself in the form of slut walks and other such movements that is basically determined to send the message that women shouldn't have to defend themselves because no one should ever attack them.
Hey everybody, listen up.
Listen up, guys.
Hey guys, listen up.
No one should ever hit a woman.
Not their wife, not their girlfriend, not their date.
No woman should have to fear violence.
Especially not from someone they know and trust.
But that's the reality for too many women.
We have to change it.
It's up to each of us, because even one is too many.
Violence against women hurts all of us. Growing up, I was ashamed and afraid of my father when he abused my mom.
The worst abuse of power is when a man raises his hand to hurt a woman. We all have to take responsibility. So if you see someone threatening a woman, step up, speak out, and get help.
Dating violence hurts all of us. So step up and help end it. Because one is too many.
One is too many.
One is too many.
One is too many.
End the violence.
Because it's wrong.
Because one One is too many.
Ideally, that would make perfect sense, except the only people who need to hear that don't care who they end up hurting, and when those sex offenders rear their ugly heads, it would be nice to know that the victim, most likely a woman because sexual assault never happens to men, at least knows some basic form of self-defense. And yet, we keep coming up with excuses for why women shouldn't have to fix anything themselves, boiling down to Anita's video itself. To paraphrase the quote from the game Vigilante, the game developers are producing sexist video games. Take the power into your own hands. But of course, that would involve doing something productive and coming up with your own storyboards, and we can't have that. No, Anita has a problem with video games, and she wants the presumably male developers to fix this problem for her. If she didn't, she would have used the $1,600,000 to give us a new video game heroine as opposed to giving a lecture about the supposed lack of such. This is the truly horrible irony behind the whole debacle when you take the time to look at how this shit started and some of the responses from people essentially trying to shield Anita from online abuse that everyone with a penis at least, is expected to just grin and bear. You see, Anita herself basically plays the role of the damsel that needs saving from internet trolls and harassment. Instead of actually addressing any of the trolls directly or just ignoring them, which is what she usually does to her credit, she publicized the verbal abuse in order to paint a picture that the gaming community itself was sexist, as opposed to simply outing the trolls themselves.
Yeah. Turns out that there are a bunch of male gamers out there who were, shall we say, not too excited about this project. Now, I'm a pop culture critic, I am a feminist, and I'm a woman. And I'm all of these things openly on the internet. So I'm no stranger to some level of sexist backlash. I've sadly gotten used to sexist slurs and sexist insults, usually involving kitchens and sandwiches. But what happened this time was a little bit different. I found myself the target of a massive online hate campaign. Now, the next couple of slides represent just a tiny fraction of the harassment I received, and they come with a very large trigger warning. All of my social media sites were flooded with threats of rape, violence, sexual assault, death, and you'll notice that these threats and comments were all specifically targeting my gender. The Wikipedia article about me was vandalized with sexism, racism, and pornographic images. There was a campaign to report all of my social media accounts, including my Kickstarter, my YouTube, my Twitter, and they would report them as fraud, as spam, even as terrorism, in an effort to get them suspended. They attempted to knock my website offline, hack into my email and other accounts. They attempted to collect and distribute my personal information, including my home address and phone number. There were images made, pornographic images made in my likeness being raped by video game characters and sent to me again and again. There was even a game made where players were invited to beat the bitch up, in which upon clicking on the screen, an image of me would become increasingly battered and bruised. You get the point, we'll move on. What's even more disturbing, if that's even possible, than this overt display of misogyny on a grand scale is that the perpetrators openly referred to this harassment campaign and their abuse as a game. They referred to their abuse as a game. So, in their minds, they concocted this grand fiction in which they're the heroic players of a massively multiplayer online game working together to take down an enemy. And apparently they cast me in the role of the villain. And what was my big diabolical master plan? To make a series of videos on YouTube about women's representations in games. Yeah.
See, here's my beef with this particular standpoint. To argue that there is sexism in the gaming community that needs to be addressed isn't a problem. Hell, it's the only real reason why hashtags like one reason why have the potential to help the community. If there is sexism in gaming, we need to point it out and address it for what it is, so the backward sexist attitudes that are apparently still rampant at the very least don't spill to our favorite hobby. However, the context of Anita's argument regarding sexism in gaming and the apparent need for someone to change the content within the games themselves, as if they're somehow to blame for the misogyny shown in the players, insinuates that gaming itself is currently sexist. To put it bluntly, Anita is simply Jack Thompson with a vagina, hence the lack of any peer-reviewed studies with consistent results that prove that games turn people, mainly boys, into girl-hating maniacs. Not that I'm surprised, because this is the same lack of factual backing seen when Jack and the rest of the Super Censorship Squadron couldn't actually explain how video games made children more violent. Before anyone points that such studies do, in fact, exist, may I remind you that none of those studies actually stand up to scrutiny, nor do they actually demonstrate with any sense of objectivity how sex and violence in media are responsible for the behavior of children more so than parenting or life experiences. In other words, it's like saying that video games were responsible for Sandy Hook because video games promote gun violence. Oh wait, people are actually trying to say that.
Let me show you the story that while all of this gun control talk is going on, no one is standing on. CBS News has reported, but then it just disappeared, that Adam Lanza, the guy who was the shooter and the killer in the Sandy Hook massacre, had, quote, a trove of violent video games and would actually black out his game room so the only reality in the room was his TV screen. Lanza saw his victims as merely characters in a video game. Hear me clearly. This is exactly what we reported on the week this happened, that they were mere characters in a video game. And he believed every kill would increase his score. That is exactly what Dave Grossman told us. We are living in dangerous and perilous times. We must do everything we can to keep our family members, our children, and those we know awake for as long as we can. We have to do everything we can to make sure that the heart does not grow cold. Virtual reality is meshing now with reality, and we're at the very beginning of this. Our sons and daughters are becoming desensitized to right and wrong. If your kid is playing these video games, you have to step up now. I beg you. Pray on it if you want confirmation. Video games are a gateway drug for our kids, and instead of a high, they get a numbness. They get an indifferent heart and a mind that cannot tell the difference between fiction and reality. This is medical fact. This is not crazy theory.
Anyway, unlike Jack Thompson, Anita has the glorious feminist glow to help aid her on her quest to impose her own disdain onto gaming culture. What I mean by feminist glow is that since Anita is a feminist and a woman on top of that, these chivalrous heroes of the internet will defend her on the basis that this is the only real reason anyone would have for attacking her. Look how poorly conceived her actual arguments are. One of the worst examples of this comes from a man I quite honestly have a lot of respect for, despite the fact that I tend to disagree with a lot of the things he says. Anyone familiar with Bob Chipman, aka Movie Bob, may be familiar with his chivalrous white knighting of Anita in response to all the hateful forum comments regarding her first video. Which comments he's actually talking about is, of course, never specified, but it sure as fuck wasn't from his own blog, because I fucking frequent it. I can assure you he couldn't have been talking about us. Anyway, Bob's response is a mess of reactionary garbage for two main reasons. For starters, he constantly talks down to trolls who couldn't possibly be watching his video, and ultimately blows the reaction to Anita's videos out of proportion without pointing out at least a few examples, all while talking down to the actual audience.
Well now, after all the waiting, all the consternation, all the fighting and virtual bloodshed, the first episode of Feminist Frequency, aka Anita Sarkeesian's Tropes vs. Women in Video Games, has finally been released on March the 7th of this year, one day prior to International Women's Day. I watched it, and then I watched all the miscreants and trolls crawl out and vomit a thick slime of bile all over themselves, all hoping that they could get at least some of it to stick to a woman they decided they hated a long time ago. Well, I've got something to say to those guys, and that...
Lastly, Bob never actually addresses the video itself, though he insists that it's academic and well-researched. Ironically enough, even Bob himself basically admits that the video isn't about shit, and that's the problem. If you're going to go out of your way to conjure up $6,000 to make videos about sexism in video games, and come up with 25 times the amount you fucking asked for, It would be nice if the college level analysis not only had some kind of actual references and explanations behind how the games impact players, but was actually a fucking analysis in itself. The actual trope itself has never really explored Anita's video. That's saying a lot because it's not like there isn't anything there worth looking into. For example, when Anita mentions Princess Zelda, a character that I'm sure most actual gamers can agree is far from being represented as incapable, there is a subtle distinction between what capable and incapable apparently mean within the context of the Zelda game Ocarina of Time. It should be noted that this is the closest thing to actually having a point Anita presents in her video, and I'm fairly positive this was done by accident because she never fully addresses it. You see, Zelda is trying to hide from Ganon so she isn't used against Hyrule by him since she possesses the Triforce of Wisdom. In order to do this, Zelda takes the form of a Sheikon boy named, well, Sheik. For those of us actually familiar with gaming history, we already know about the controversy revolving around whether Sheik is male or female. The reason I bothered to bring this up is because Anita claims that Zelda is at her best when in the form of either Sheik or Tetra. What this means is that in order for Zelda to be considered a strong female character in Anita's eyes, she apparently needs to fulfill yet another offensive trope, the man with boobs. Not only is this hilariously ass backwards, this highlights an issue with gender expectations that we have here in the West and many parts of the world. Apparently, Zelda returning to her more traditionally feminine form is a sign of weakness, because if it wasn't, there would be little reason for her to be suddenly kidnapped or suddenly need protection. At least, this is what Anita implies by bothering to highlight these incidents in Ocarina of Time and Wind Waker, because revealing her whereabouts again, it couldn't possibly have anything to do with her being captured, because it's not like that's why she was hiding in the first fucking place. The problem, so to speak, here is that Zelda's alter egos are all oddly masculine, especially Sheik, who is literally referred to as young man in the game. When Sheik turns back into Zelda and is captured by Ganon, it is literally a transformation from masculine to feminine. To say that Sheik is shown to be strong and capable may mean very little, considering that the game may in fact be encouraging the offensive stereotype that in order for a woman to be even remotely useful, she needs to emulate stereotypically male behavior. Considering the game's context, I get why Zelda has to basically dress in drag to escape Ganon, but the idea that femininity is somehow a synonym for weakness doesn't make much sense to me. Hence the United Kingdom Ocarina of Time ad that basically asserts this very way of thinking. This brings us to a real-world example of how this idea is actually imposed on society even today. I know it's apparently evil of me to dare to mention this on the web nowadays for frankly ridiculous reasons, but the fact of the matter is that things like the drafting process enacted by the military is a perfect example of how masculinity is prized over femininity. Whether or not you want to accept it, only men get drafted in pretty much any society I can think of. This is because things like war, along with many other physical tasks, are considered things that men have to take care of because women are apparently incapable of doing it thanks to gender stereotypes. This is why women had a demand to be allowed to volunteer to join the army, which initially didn't allow women. It also didn't allow homosexuals either, and this idea of masculinity equaling power probably had a lot to do with that. Well, that and good old-fashioned homophobia. The funny thing about drafting is that it completely ignores whether or not the man being drafted wants to fight, because it honestly doesn't matter. It's considered against the law to decline the draft. In short, it forces men to fight and die regardless of whether or not they want to do so. It's not that women have never engaged in combat in the past, but fighting in wars was never considered one of women's civic duties. What does this have to do with video games? Well, here's the thing. Anita is complaining about the lack of heroines in a world where men are the ones tasked with all the fighting. None of the knight errants Anita refers to in her video were expected to be enacted by women onto men. This is most likely why, in games for killing monsters and fighting off potential rapists were the main goal of the game, that most video game heroes are designed as males. The inconvenient truth, no matter how offensive, is that men are generally stronger than women. Women are, and this isn't a socially constructed myth by any means. Again, I'll leave the details in the description, but men are typically stronger than women are on average, and this embodies itself in the form of sports segregation, something we wouldn't need if men and women could truly compete in physical sports on the same level. To top it off, comparisons between men's sports records and women's sports records show a significant difference in physical performance. Let me put it this way. If the idea that women are weaker than men is a socially constructed myth, why not have men and women compete against each other in sports? Why give women their own basketball league when they can just join the original NBA? The statistics would suggest that the reason, no matter how controversial, is that they really can't be expected to compete. If it was up to me, it wouldn't be like that, but gender inequality sure as fuck wasn't my fault. So when you have games designed around fighting monsters and basically overcoming physical tasks, the cold hard truth is that it makes more sense to have a male protagonist, because not only were these acts expected of men in real life, but also makes more sense for men to do these things as they are more biologically designed to do so. What Anita doesn't seem to recognize, despite her touching on this subject in previous videos, that the cultural views on femininity versus masculinity is what encourages the usage of this trope in the first place, which is why such things as a female protagonist or a Gears of War game are considered hard to justify. Considering the fact that Sheik is simply a gender bender of Zelda, one needs to ask themselves why femininity is automatically weak, or rather, why should women, fictional or not, have to give up their femininity in order to be considered strong and capable? I hardly believe that every single woman serving in the military or naval forces today is a dyke or a lesbian. Just like I highly doubt that every man in these services is ultra masculine or even straight for that matter. This is actually kind of funny, considering that in order to portray Peach and Zelda as capable heroines, she literally shows a picture of the two damsels photoshopped into looking like Mario and Link. Considering the fictional settings of most games and supernatural elements in them, why should either woman be forced to basically emulate masculinity to be strong and capable, especially since the man with boobs trope is somehow offensive as well, which is also hilarious because it enforces the idea that men and women have to act certain ways, as if to say a man acting like a woman isn't really a man and vice versa. Ironically enough, this proposed thought process imposes the same negative stereotyping that men often have in video games in the form of ultra-masculine meatheads devoid of any real humanity or emotion. Yeah, I know it's against the rules to talk about stereotypes regarding men, but in all seriousness, characters like Marcus Phoenix and Kratos kill hundreds of usually male, though occasionally female, NPCs, while very rarely showing any empathy or even acknowledging the mass murders they commit throughout the game. Hell, the recent God of War Ascension was easily the first time Kratos showed any genuine emotion that wasn't pure anger over the loss of his wife and child, the women in his refrigerator, so to speak.
For you to be free, I must die by your hand.
I do not understand.
If you do not release me, my father will retain power over you, but even worse, I will live in eternal torture.
I have spilled enough innocent blood.
Basically, the Photoshop picture not only implies that Peach and Zelda should be more like Mario and Link, but it also insinuates that they should be less like themselves. In other words, less feminine. Again, Anita is basically trying to fix one negative trope by deploying another negative trope at it, the man with boobs. This is quite funny, as Anita is no stranger to this deeply ingrained societal belief that one must be masculine in order to be considered strong. Many of her older videos point out this societal construct, and though she has never really explained why it's bad beyond encouraging these patronizing and paternal views of women mentioned in the video, and apparently playing a part in discouraging men from showing emotion while telling them to solve problems with violence, the point is that Anita's attempt to deconstruct video games really just ends up with her regurgitating the same old shit she's been saying for over 3 years now. Watch her True Grit and Lego Friends videos, and you'll see what I'm talking about. If you watch those videos, the Lego one in particular, it becomes fairly apparent right off the bat what her problem with Princess Peach essentially is. While characters like Kratos and Marcus Phoenix represent the ultra-masculine stereotype, Princess Peach easily embodies the ultra-feminine stereotype. Hence the point she alludes to regarding Super Princess Peach, the game starring Peach as the main protagonist who is tasked with saving Mario. Using Anita's logic, this is a form of objectification because Mario is being acted upon instead of Peach simply letting Mario reclaim his own freedom. See how the genders of the damsel and the hero are reversed in this game? Is it still sexist? Anyway, she claims that she'll go into further detail about Peach's game in part 2 to this trope, but we all know what she's going to say. In Super Princess Peach, Peach's main ability is her emotions. In other words, she uses the powers of PMS to save Mario. This, of course, depicts women as fragile and overly emotional, which is somehow offensive because Peach being an overly emotional girly girl must mean that every woman in the Mushroom Kingdom is like that. Well, except for Princess Daisy from the neighboring kingdom Sasaraland, who I'm sure doesn't count simply because she isn't in any of the main series games, and the one game she did appear in, Super Mario Land for the Game Boy, she gets kidnapped by an alien named Tatanga, just like Peach is kidnapped by Bowser. Oh, and props to Anita for pretty much excluding all the Mario spin-off games in which both Peach and Daisy are shown to be competent participants that are more than capable of competing with all the boys in racing, sports, and party games. Surely, since all but one Super Mario game that originally had two female characters in it had Peach get kidnapped, this means that Shigeru Miyamoto must have belittling views of women, a point that the tone of her video heavily implies, though she never outright calls Miyamoto sexist. Of course, this makes little sense as to why such an apparently backwards thinking person like Miyamoto, a god amongst game designers, would crank out a character like Princess Daisy. Think about it. She doesn't really wear makeup as opposed to Peach, who wears blandly obvious lipstick. She has rather tomboyish demeanor as shown in most of her concept art past Super Mario Land, and she's only been kidnapped once, so she apparently isn't objectified as often as Peach. In my honest opinion, Daisy is an example of a more ideal princess character due to the fact that she possesses many feminine traits without being a complete exaggeration of them like Peach tends to be. What relevance does Daisy have, you ask? Well, that's just it. Anita acts as if Princess Daisy, along with all the spin-off games that include Peach and sometimes Daisy as playable characters, are simply not worth discussing. This is most likely due to the fact that those games don't fit into her narrative. What's even more damaging to her argument is that these spin-off games, many of which like Super Paper Mario and Super Mario RPG have Peach in a much more active role, outnumber the main series tremendously. How much so? Well, there's 14 games in the main series, while there are 7 Mario Kart games, 9 Mario Party games, countless sport games. You get the idea. Also, since Wario is technically part of the Mario universe, you could argue that the WarioWare games featuring Mona and Ashley also count as counterexamples to Anita's assertions about the Mario series. Basically, she's complaining about Peach not being an active member of the game's escapades, which would have made more sense had these spin-off titles never existed. It's also worth noting that in Super Mario Bros. 3, Mario is tasked with saving 7 Mushroom Kings along with saving Princess Peach. Are the kings being objectified the same way Peach supposedly is? You see, this is why Anita's ball analogy makes absolutely no sense.
The subject is the protagonist, the one who the story is centered on and the one doing most of the action. In video games, this is almost always the main playable character, and the one from whose perspective most of the story is seen. So the damsel trope typically makes men the subject of narratives, while relegating women to the role of object. This is a form of objectification because as objects, damseled women are being acted upon, most often becoming or reduced to a prize to be won, a treasure to be found, or a goal to be achieved. The brief intro sequence accompanying many classic arcade games tends to reinforce the framing of women as a possession that's been stolen from the protagonist. The hero's fight to retrieve his stolen property then provides the lazy justification for the actual gameplay. At its heart, the damsel trope is not really about women at all. She simply becomes the central object in a competition between men, at least in its traditional incarnations. I've heard it said that in the game of patriarchy, women are not the opposing team, they are the ball. So for example, we can think of the Super Mario franchise as a grand game being played between Mario and Bowser, and Princess Peach's role is essentially that of the ball. The two men are tossing her back and forth over the course of the main series, each trying to keep and take possession of the damsel ball.
Not only does she insinuate that the male protagonist and male antagonist have the same allegedly sexual incentives, but it also assumes that the player views the damsels as stolen property as opposed to people who need saving. So I guess the Seven Kings from Super Mario 3 were just Mario's stolen property, and his objective was to save them so they could later suck his dick afterwards, right? Anita goes out of her way to use clips from games that apparently fit this narrative without even touching the context of any of the games in question. To her credit, most of them can technically fit into the rape or death scenario I mentioned earlier, though I find it hilarious that Kid Icarus is shown in her montage considering that the main villain, Medusa, is female. So I guess Medusa wants to claim ownership of Palutena because she wants to scissor the shit out of her. See, this game of patriarchy she's rambling on about can only really be played amongst two men, as this is the very framing she gives this grand game. If a female player, so to speak, like Medusa wants to join in on the game of patriarchy, is the game still an offensive tale about men trying to claim ownership of a woman, or does the context magically change? Let's test Anita's analogy by using a game of matriarchy as an example. What game could possibly be about matriarchy, you ask? Well, before Yuji Naka worked on the early Sonic games, he debuted into the gaming industry with a hidden gem called Girl's Garden. In Girl's Garden, you play as Peppery, a young girl whose objective is to collect flowers for her boyfriend Mento. The reason she does this is to prevent Mento from falling in love with another girl named Coco. So Peppery faces various hazards, and by hazards I mean getting attacked by fucking bears, in order to collect enough flowers in order to maintain her ownership over Mento's affections. Obviously this is a form of objectification, because as the object, Mento is being acted upon. You don't get to play as Mento. Hell, Mento barely does anything at all. He stays in the house in the middle of each stage and waits for Peppery to give him flowers. Mento sure as fuck isn't in distress, so why can't he get his own fucking flowers? Also, the two women, Peppery and Coco, are essentially fighting over who gets to keep Mento for themselves, so you can think of Girl's Garden as a grand game being played between Peppery and Coco. The two women are the players, and Mento is the ball, you see. This means Mento is being objectified because I'm doing things to him, not for him. Just like Mario saves Peach, apparently not for her own safety, but to claim ownership of the damsel ball. After all, I'm giving flowers to Mento, which means I'm objectifying him because objects get acted upon. See how flawed Anita's revised definition of objectification is? Also, Anita mentions the subject-object dichotomy, which is a philosophical reference to the Cartesian model of self. Now, I'm not going to sit here and break down the entirety of this philosophy to you, as that would take up even more time. But all you really need to know is this. The subject-object dichotomy is, according to the description given on Wikipedia, a long-standing philosophical issue is concerned with the analysis of human experience and arises from the premise that the world consists of objects, entities, which are perceived or otherwise presumed to exist as entities by subjects, observers. In other words, the observer is the subject and the entities are the object. Notice how this definition doesn't specify who or what in particular is supposed to be the object. That's because it doesn't have to. When related to video games and even other mediums, the subject is the protagonist and the objects are, well, everything else. So for example, in Super Mario Galaxy, Mario is the subject because the game is about his adventure, and Peach, Rosalina, and Bowser, along with all the other NPCs and enemies, are objects because they are the entities that the world of Super Mario Galaxy consists of. So basically, Anita devalues her own argument Because if you apply the subject-object dichotomy to every video game ever made, the subject will always be the player, and everything else, regardless of race or gender, are objects because they aren't supposed to be you. This defeats the whole point in pointing out that the damsels are somehow objectified, as their captors are just as much of an object as they are, because they aren't the subject of the story, the protagonist is. This explains why Anita emphasizes on having Peach and Zelda take the lead in their own games, because there is really no other way for them not to be considered objects, since everything that isn't playable is an object. So in Super Princess Peach, you can say that Peach is the subject because it's her adventure, and Mario and Bowser are the objects because Peach has to save Mario and defeat Bowser. Both of these things being actions the player, through the perspective of Peach, enacts onto the objects Mario and Bowser. Of course, all this talk about objects is really only based around the idea that the damsel is an object of desire and a prize to be won. Anita projects preconceived notions on what the player incentive essentially is without really explaining how this effectively taps into what she calls adolescent male power fantasies, because male power fantasies and female power fantasies are apparently different, so we need to distinguish the two as opposed to just calling these straight up power fantasies. I also love how she insinuates that the usage of this trope by game developers was specifically to sell more games to not only boys and men, but straight boys and men. Fuck lesbians and transsexuals. By that logic, these games were made to appeal to white power fantasies because the hero was usually some white dude and the damsel was usually some white chick. I mean shit, the most iconic damsel, Princess Peach, is blonde and blue-eyed. Ergo, this must be a sign of white supremacy, right? All jokes aside, the problem here should be pretty obvious because Anita is not fucking Jean Grey. Unless part 2 to this trope includes some supporting evidence as to why the incentive behind the business decisions these companies made was mainly to capitalize on adolescent male power fantasies, she's really just making the assumption that women are being subjugated for enjoyment of the presumably male player as opposed to simply being used as a plot device to advance the hero's story arc. Because it's his, and sometimes her, story arc, the main character's trials and empowerment is what matters within the context of the game. Fuck everyone else, including the damsel. Why, you ask? Because the subject-object dichotomy. That's why. Peach gets captured so Mario can have a reason for existence. Minto starts looking at other women so Paprika can have a lazy justification to pick flowers and feed killer bears honey. It's funny because Anita says in the video that the trope isn't really about women at all, which is kind of the truth, considering that the damsel is not always female. And Mario is missing, fucking awful game by the way, Luigi has to find Mario. In the original Sonic the Hedgehog games, Sonic has to save the animals that are being turned into robots. Guess I should let them all save themselves because not doing that is objectification somehow. All Anita is doing is applying the same logic she uses in her other videos like the what liquor ads teach us about guys and women in refrigerators to the player based on the preconceived notion that the players, you know, the men, already think like this. The men playing these games apparently see Peach, Zelda, Crystal, or whoever the fuck as prizes, not people. You can only come to this conclusion if you're a fucking psychic-type Pokemon.
And objectifying women is just another amusing pastime because, you know, when we're walking down the street, we're just there for your visual pleasure.
The Dawson foul, tell me about it.
Yeah, the closing's in Boston.
Okay.
So get your game face on.
It's on.
Happy birthday!
Guys never change. Neither do we. Jim Beam, the bourbon since 1795.
Guys never change, and neither does the offensive advertising. Liquor ads take the worst possible masculine traits, repackage it, and sell it right back to them, continuing this cycle of sex. Writers are using the women in refrigerators trope to literally trade a female character's life for the benefit of a male character's story arc. They're making clear that women, even powerful female superheroes, are basically disposable. It's important to remember that these comics don't exist in a vacuum, that they're created by artists and writers who live in the same sexist social systems that we all do, and that's reflected in the characters and the stories. It's saddening to see how flippantly and trivially violence against women is treated in comic book pages, even with the most powerful of female superheroes, especially when violence against women in the real world are at epidemic levels. We have to remember that the Women in Refrigerators list was created for us to identify, understand, and resist the variety of ways that women and our fictional representations are disempowered and victimized. I'm not saying women can't ever die in comic books, but it matters how and why they die. So comic book, TV and movie writers, and video game producers, stop relying on stereotypical tropes. Stop using violence against women as a way to further the storyline of your male hero, and start writing us as full and complete human beings. Okay? Okay.
Okay, so we get that Anita is pissed about women being used as tools to advance male-driven plots, and she apparently views any hint of physical beauty as a justification, which is silly because of the difference between being a sex doll and simply being attractive. But of course, all men see women as objects anyway, so there's no point in explaining how you managed to come to such a radical conclusion anyway. Folks, let's get this out of the way right now. Sexual objectification isn't new. Look up sexual slavery if you don't believe me. However, the only thing that possibly hints to this incentive is making the damsel look sexy. Hence why Anita bothers to point out Crystal's redesign, and the concept art for Crystal sure as fuck doesn't hurt her case. The problem is that this doesn't say shit about how the player interprets the sexuality of the damsel in question. For example, in Crash Bandicoot, Tanya Bandicoot has noticeably large breasts and hips. In fact, the character is based off of Pamela Anderson. She, of course, gets kidnapped, and Crash wants to save her to win her over, only to get his ass dumped in later installments as she leaves him for Pinstripe. Or so the story goes. There's a couple of rumors as to why Tanya magically disappears in later Crash Bandicoot games, but the widely accepted belief is that Naughty Dog was forced by their publisher to redesign Tanya because she wasn't considered family-friendly because, you know, tits. Anyway, Naughty Dog didn't like the fact that Tanya had to be redesigned to fit into the mold of what was family-friendly for a kid's game that has you get eaten, torched, and lacerated throughout its entirety. So instead of compromising their artistic vision, they just scrapped Tanya altogether and placed her with Crash's much more modestly attired sister Coco. This is essentially the reason why Coco's appearance in Crash 2 is so abrupt, and this may also explain why Coco is depicted as being an intelligent computer whiz, to show Sony or whoever the fuck had a problem with Tanya that the folks at Naughty Dog totally weren't sexist in any way. Let's just ignore the fact that Crash is literally a fucking idiot, but at least he's the main character, right? Coco and Cortez are just objects because the subject-object dichotomy would describe them as such. Well, save for Crash 3, since Coco is playable in a very small number of levels, but that still technically makes her the subject for a little while. Let's just ignore all the Crash games past 3, since those of you familiar with Crash already know that Anita's game of patriarchy logic doesn't apply to any Crash game past the first one. So basically, we can assume that since the damsels in most of the examples Anita cherry picks can be considered physically attractive, this is somehow the game developer's way of telling the player that the damsel should be desired, that the damsel is their prize to be won for beating the game. However, there is a huge snag in that argument. And that snag is that all the developers actually managed to do is establish the main character's feelings and incentives. This has absolutely nothing to do with the player unless you believe that adolescent male power fantasies is something all men are predisposed to. And if that's the case, why go after the games for something that they're supposedly projecting onto boys? The boys already think this because all men are inherently sexist, apparently. After all, how is it possible for developers to tap into adolescent male power fantasies if it's the games that have to project this idea of empowerment onto the boys first? Ergo, they couldn't possibly believe in this fantasy until after they play these games. I say this because Anita implies that there are larger ramifications for using the damsel in distress trope, and that the usage of the trope in this manner normalizes patronizing and paternalistic attitudes towards women, and makes men view women as sex objects, somehow. Anyway, for any of that shit to be true, the games need to have an actual effect on the way the player interprets real-life scenarios. Not only is any such research absent in Anita's video, there's no generally credible source you can find to support this statement any more so than the constant claims that violent video games train children to become violent. Anita also doesn't cover on how this trope may affect young girls and people of different sexual orientation, because the narrative she's weaving is about straight men making games for other straight men. In other words, the trope has less to do with video games and more to do with the people making the games. It's almost as if the alleged sexism in video games has nothing to do with sexism in the real world. Spoiler alert, it fucking doesn't. Speaking of real-world scenarios, let's examine more of the games in Anita's montage and apply them to real-world context. In Splatterhouse, Rick and Jenny end up in a demonic mansion after trying to avoid a storm. Jenny gets kidnapped by demons, and Rick nearly fucking dies. In order to save Jenny and, not die, Rick dons the infamous Terror Mask, which changes him from a meek geek to yet another ultra-masculine murderous psychopath. Like Kratos, Marcus, Ryu Hayabusa, yada yada, and all the other adolescent male power fantasy characters. Anyway, he eventually finds Jenny while pissed off, and the demons apparently gave her hell herpes because now she's a demon too, which of course makes Rick even more pissed off than before. Rick is then forced to kill Jenny, and this little clip happens. Now, I'd imagine that the sad-sounding music was an indication that Jenny's death is a bad thing. Rick seems to think so, as he proceeds to enter the bowels of a giant fetus to kill the monster at the end or whatever. Splatterhouse had a ridiculous plot. I mean, the main villain, if you can call him that, is Dr. West, and he's dead long before the game even starts, so really, you're just cleaning up the fucker's mess. Then there's that thing with Hell Chaos possibly being a mutated Dr. West. It's fucking stupid. Okay, so now that we've gotten the gist of Splatterhouse so-called story, let's break it down. So your girlfriend gets abducted by demons, and she ends up dying anyway, so I think it's safe to assume they want to kill her. In order to prevent this, you sell your soul to an evil mask that turns the wearer into the Incredible fucking Hulk. You can't save your girlfriend, so you take her out of her misery and then proceed to take out all of your rage on fetuses. None of that sounds like the player is expected to objectify Jenny at all. One thing to keep note of here is that when most people say objectification, they're usually referring to a form of dehumanization. That's what objectification is supposed to mean in terms of denying subjectivity. The goal of Splatterhouse, from Ricky's point of view, is to save Jenny because Jenny is the woman he loves. They're boyfriend and girlfriend long before the game starts, and Rick obviously gives a shit about her because the entirety of the second Splatterhouse game has you trying to find Jenny's soul in order to resurrect her from the fucking dead. And the third Splatterhouse? Well, apparently Rick and Jenny had some freaky necrosex, because now Rick and Jenny's son, David, is in the picture. And what happens in Splatterhouse 3? You guessed it. Jenny and David get kidnapped by the evil one, and Rick has to save his wife and child. So what does this have to do with sexism in video games? You tell me, because that's the problem here. It makes perfect sense for someone to risk their lives for someone they love when they're put in grave danger. It is obviously Rick's incentive, and the player can interpret this in whatever way they choose. If John Hinckley can watch the movie Taxi Driver and interpret that as meaning kill Ronald Reagan, then I think it's safe to say whatever implications the game makes about how you're supposed to view Jenny doesn't actually determine what you think about Jenny. Hence why the super sexual candid photos that Jenny leaves around as clues in the 2010 Splatterhouse remake doesn't necessarily mean that you, the player, see Jenny as nothing but a sexy prize to be won, especially since you'd have no way of knowing those pictures were even in the game if you bought it blindly on launch.
My hero. Come here and get your reward.
Also, would Rick's son David be considered a prize to be won in Splatterhouse 3? Because he's in as much distress as Jenny. Hell, both characters can actually die depending on the player's actions, so really the only prize being won here is their freedom and safety, since the game is telling you that's what's important. Poo-tang isn't the prerogative. Now let's look at Violent Storm. In a post-apocalyptic future that takes place after World War III, an evil group of thugs called the Gled Gang wreak terror across the wastelands. 3 ultra-masculine dude bro buddies come to find that their woman, since she's their property, has been kidnapped while performing one of the most sexist things a woman could hope to do to objectify herself. That thing being grocery shopping. In response to Red Freddy taking away their bitch, might as well call her that because she's my property, Boris, Wade, and Kyle go on a magical dude bro adventure to do dude bro stuff before finally reclaiming their stolen case of Mike's Hard Lemonade. Or beer? I don't know, it has something to do with an object, not a person, that much I know. Seriously though, when you get to Lord Geld's personal whorehouse, you're treated to this scene. See how I cropped that scene? Yeah, I did that on purpose. Why? To show you that Sheena, who I meant to refer to as bitch because she's my property, is obviously sad. She's crying. Last time I checked, objects don't have feelings. When's the last time your chair cried? And no, that time Patty Sanchez sat on it doesn't count. You know, maybe Sheena, I mean bitch, is crying because she's bound to a ball and chain against her will, of course, and forced to be the personal sex slave of a purple rapist whose balls obviously haven't dropped. Okay, you see the problem here, right? If you don't, then let me spell it out for you. In the final stage of Violent Storm, there's a section with these caged women who are obviously trapped and upset. They magically perk up when you break the cage door and free them. Now, why would Lord Geld have a cage full of women unless he had plans for them after capturing them? It's almost like the only one denying these women their humanity and is ultimately objectifying them is Lord Geld. But he's the bad guy, and we all know, because Anita says so, that the player is the one who views these women as objects, as prizes to be won. See, this is the flaw in Anita's argument. Bluto, Bowser, Ganondorf, Geld, you know, the bad guys, they're the ones objectifying these women, not the protagonist. The protagonist is tasked with saving the damsel from literal objectification. Considering how the illegal sex trading system and good old-fashioned sexual assault are still problems today, you'd think that teaching young straight males to actually fight against this shit will be a good thing, right? I mean, the subject, you know, the protagonist, is meant to save the damsel from these kinds of assholes. He is not tasked with becoming one of them in these games. For people to engage in these adolescent male power fantasies and get the idea that women are somehow their property makes it even more glaringly apparent that the content within the games and behavior of the players are separate in virtually every possible way. In all seriousness, how do you teach young men to view women as property if that isn't even the point of the game? Are they identifying with the villain instead? As far as the context of the game goes, the message is quite the opposite. To top it off, you'd have to be pretty sadistic to not care about these kinds of damsels in distress in real life, especially when you consider their rather distressing cries for help. It actually sounds a little creepy to me because some of these clips sound as if they're already dying.
Please help me!
Really, unless you're an outright sadist, which we kind of all are deep down inside if the popularity of violent media is any indication, then you would likely want to protect these people rather than hurt them further. And yet people like Colin Stokes seem to think media such as this apparently teaches people, specifically men, that women belong to them, while at the same time denying that he's actually saying that. Kind of like how feminists tend to contradict themselves constantly while never contradicting themselves. See what I did there?
1 out of 5 women in America say that they have been sexually assaulted sometime in their life. Now, I don't think that's the fault of popular entertainment. I don't think kids' movies have anything to do with that. But something is going wrong. And when I hear that statistic, one of the things I think of is that's a lot of sexual assailants. Who are these guys? What are they learning? What are they failing to learn? Are they absorbing the story that a male hero's job is to defeat the villain with violence and then collect the reward, which is a woman who has no friends and doesn't speak? Are we soaking up that story? You know, as a parent with the privilege of raising a daughter, like all of you who are doing the same thing, we find this world and this statistic very alarming, and we want to prepare them. We have tools at our disposal like girl power, and we hope that that will help. But I gotta wonder, is girl power going to protect them if at the same time, actively or passively, we are training our sons to maintain their boy power? And I'm talking mainly to the dads here. I think we have got to show our sons a new definition of manhood. Now, the definition of manhood is already turning upside down. I mean, you've read about how the new economy is changing the roles of caregiver and wage earner. They're throwing it up in the air. So our sons are going to have to find some way of adapting to this, some new relationship with each other. And I think we really have to show them and model for them how a real man is someone who trusts his sisters and respects them and wants to be on their team and stands up against the real bad guys, who are the men who want to abuse the women. And I think our job in the Netflix queue is to look out for those movies that pass the Bechdel test, if we can find them, and to seek out the heroines who are there, who show real courage, who bring people together, and to nudge our sons to identify with those heroines and to say, I want to be on their team, because they're going to be.
Yeah, so apparently games that have you save women from rapists turn you into rapists because Colin Stokes said so, but they don't really turn you into rapists because Colin Stokes said so. Really, what the fuck is this shit? By that logic, which is basically the same as Anita's, the game Double Dragon is just a story of a man retrieving his stolen property. So since the women are objects in stolen property, I should be able to replace each damsel in distress with an actual object, and the story should remain unchanged. After all, if Marion is just a prize to be won, then she should be no different from a car or a sandwich. So let's pretend that, since my PS3 is broken anyway, Shelly the PS3 gets stolen by the evil Black Warriors. Says Billy wants to get his PS3 back, I guess he really wants to keep his save files. He goes on a thug-thumping rampage to get it back. His brother Jimmy may accompany him, but the story is really about Billy, since it's his PS3 that got stolen, not Jimmy's. Billy will have to face apparently a bunch of white guys with terrible haircuts, and from behind these double doors, wait, who are these broads? I get it now. In order to reinforce to me the idea that women are weak and incapable, these insidious game developers are sending out a bunch of women within the first 30 seconds of the first fucking level to fight me. Really, folks? This is the research Anita needed $6,000 for? Because, you know, having women stop you from saving other women totally sends the message that women are weak and incapable, right? And yes, that cruelly animated sprite is indeed a woman. Her name is Linda Lash, and she has been a recurring enemy in pretty much every Double Dragon game ever made. In fact, she's even in Double Dragon Neon. Hell, she's on the damn cover. Granted, she's a lot more revealing in that game, but shit, she's still in it. In fact, that opening scene where Marion, or the PS3, gets punched in the gut has Linda there with the rest of the thugs this time around.
Marion? Oh man, not this again.
Oh, and I absolutely adore how cartwheeling cannon fodder Williams is referred to as, well, cannon fodder. It really highlights the whole male disposability thing that our current drafting system practices. Or at least it would if Linda didn't show up. Again, she appears in the first level. See, what Anita is basically trying to do here is tell us all how these games portray women as inherently weak and incapable, yet quite a few of the games she uses as examples have female enemies that attack the player. If women are weak and incapable in these games, then why are they whipping you, stabbing you, and jump kicking you in the face? Seriously, Linda isn't alone in Double Dragon Neon either. She's accompanied by skimpy female ninjas and geisha that also attack Billy.
Rouse me up. Push, child.
The point here is that unless the Damsel in Distress is meant to be a representation of all women within the world the game takes place in, you really can't objectively take all of her characteristics and apply them to not only every female character in that particular game, but every woman in real life. Let's be honest with ourselves here. Unless we just assume the player is, well, stupid, there's no realistic way that one woman being disempowered via kidnapping is going to send anyone the message that women are weak and incapable, especially if the game has female enemies. For the record, Violent Storm also had female enemies in it in the form of Liza and her recolor, Eliza. So yeah, even the game with the fucking sex slaves in it threw female opponents at you. While we're on the topic of fighting women, Anita's montage shows Final Fight is yet another game that apparently enforces this dreaded stereotype that women are weak and incapable. This game, of course, had female opponents as well in the form of Poison and Roxy. Oh, and for the record, the clip I'm about to show you isn't from the first level, but Roxy does show up at the end of the first stage. Just say. To be fair, there are a lot of rumors revolving around Poison and her recolor. Supposedly Poison was female in Japan, but due to the controversy of hitting women in America, her Western counterpart is supposedly male. This story has been challenged up and down, and the gaming community has basically reached the conclusion that Poison may have always been intended to be male. In other words, Poison is supposed to be transgendered. In Japan, Poison is a straight-up guy in drag, and in America, Poison is a post-op transsexual. My point is that these characters, without knowing their past, look distinctively like women, and you have to fight them. How is this game depicting all women as weak and incapable simply because Jessica, Cody's girlfriend, gets kidnapped? How is she an object? Imagine that you really are Cody, and someone hurts Jessica, the woman you love. How would you react to this? Because I have a good idea how Cody will react.
No! Ha! The game ends here, boys, and you're the losers! One step closer and I blow a hole through her the size of the Grand Canyon!
Don't listen to him, Cody. He has to be brought to justice.
If you know what's good for you and for your girlfriend, you'll do exactly what I tell you, Cody!
Cody, now!
You hurt my Jessica!
Could you imagine yourself having that kind of reaction to, I don't know, someone eating your cheeseburger? I mean, really. Can you see yourself screaming, "You ate my cheeseburger!" Because I doubt any normal person will react that way to losing something that doesn't think, doesn't feel, and is easily replaceable. Jessica, on the other hand, is a person. What are you going to do if Jessica dies? Go to the Jessica store and buy a new Jessica? Also, Hagar, another playable character in Final Fight, is Jessica's father, and he wants to save her as well. Is Jessica his prize to be won? I can't think of any good father who would view his children as stolen property in such a situation. No mother would either, for that matter. Also, Final Fight 2 also had a damsel in distress in the form of Rena, Guy's fiancé. Guy doesn't save her, however. Carlos, Hagar, and Rena's younger sister, Maki, are the ones that save her. Oh, and did I mention that Rena and Maki's father, Genryosa, is also kidnapped? So not only do the main characters of Final Fight 2 have to save a woman and a man, but you also get to play as a woman, Maki. So if the player chooses to play as Maki, Maki becomes the subject of the game. You know, the one doing most of the action. To top it off, according to the game's canon storyline, Maki is the one who delivers the final blow on the game's main villain, Ritu. This means that the one who technically rescues Rena and Genryosa is Maki. I guess Rena and Genryosa are their reward for stopping the Mad Gear Gang. Oh, and let's not forget Final Fight 3. Nobody gets kidnapped, but you do get to play as Lucia, you know, a woman. The reason I brought up all that shit about Final Fight is because the accusation that video games, even during the golden age, depicted women as weak and incapable doesn't make a lot of sense when beat-em-up games like Final Fight and Streets of Rage had female opponents and female playable characters. In regards to Streets of Rage, the Sega game had to save Adam, the token black character from the first game who gets kidnapped by Mr. X in response to having their property stolen. See what I did there? Alex, Blaze, Skate, and Max have to come to his rescue. That's right, Blaze, a woman, has to help a typical dude bro street fighter, Adam's little brother, and an ultra-masculine pro wrestler save another ultra-masculine street fighter. Of course, there are female enemies trying to stop you in all three Streets of Rage games. Is Adam being objectified? After all, objects get acted upon, and the damsel's ordeal obviously isn't his own in Streets of Rage 2 because he needs to be rescued. I guess I should let him free himself from the clutches of a giant Tommy gun-wielding sociopath as to not disempower him. Anyway, let's get back to the Double Dragon example. So now that we've established that a lot of these games actually have female adversaries, what does that say about Billy's incentives for saving Mary or his PS3? Well, at the end of the first Double Dragon game, if you're playing cooperatively, you have to fight your brother Jimmy over who gets to save the PS3. I suppose if you really want to overanalyze a story that is told in its entirety through 10-second cutscenes, then you could insist that this scenario is about two brothers fighting each other over ownership of an object. You know, kind of like how people get mad when they find out their property is cheating on them. This, of course, has nothing to do with love or commitment, so when Billy and Jimmy fight over who gets to keep the PS3, they're fighting over who gets to claim ownership of it. Hence why one brother ends up killing the other. This ending has nothing to do with the actual canon storyline and only happens in the first Double Dragon game, but this totally counts as objectification because, I don't know, the brothers are fighting each other despite the fact that they have no realistic reason to do so. I mean, really. the plot in Double Dragon is so bare bones that I could have sworn I was playing a video game or something. Anyway, after one brother bites the dust, the PS3 magically frees itself and runs towards the remaining brother to express its love by kissing the brother on the cheek. Fuck the fact that a PS3 can't move and can't display actual emotions, not like it needs to, because in Double Dragon 2, the poor thing gets shot to death, which is weird because you can't kill something that was never alive. Apparently, Billy and Jimmy, since neither canonically dies in the first game, are so pissed about losing their favorite gaming console that they go on yet another rampage that yet again includes punching women in the face. This time, they actually kill Willie, the leader of the Black Warriors, and if you're playing the NES version, Shelly gets reballed with leaded soda that brings it back to life. The Lee brothers must really love those save files. Seriously though, I'm sure most of you find this whole Marion equal to a PS3 analogy stupid as all fuck, which is the point. Marion isn't just an object, she's a person with emotions and desires. Unless Billy is the kind of douchebag who feels no remorse over the loss of his loved ones, chances are that he truly loves Marion. Or Jimmy does, since the canon of this franchise isn't really that consistent, almost like if it were a video game. In all seriousness, if Billy really saw Marion as an object, why even save her? He could just get a new girlfriend instead. As an object, Marion is disposable and easily replaceable. Remember, love apparently has nothing to do with Billy's motives, right?
I'm finally free! Ugh, you don't want to know what I've just been through.
But he's gone now.
I'll use the power of love to send you after him.
Wicked!
Oh, and, I'm pretty sure human bodies can't survive this transition, so,
What?
It'll be fine. Just go!
Oh. Okay, well, maybe Billy and Marion really do love each other. Not like that matters. I mean, Marion should still be able to save herself just like women who get sexually assaulted in real life should be able to defend themselves, despite the fact that whenever you tell women, or rather feminists, that self-defense is important for combating rape, it's somehow victim blaming when you do that. Anyway, I'm sure Marion wasn't being denied her humanity or anything. Like, she couldn't possibly have been put into a situation that she couldn't realistically save herself from. Billy's just being an objectifying asshole, right?
You got nowhere to run, Skullmageddon. Now where's Marion?
Oh, where are my manners? I haven't introduced you to the new and improved Marion. I call her Evil Marion!
I'm bad.
You evil jerk! You're going down!
Silence, buttfinger!
Oh, she was being brainwashed, which is basically the video game equivalent to getting slipped a roofie. Well, I'm sure Skullmageddon wasn't up to anything too bad. Certainly not anything that Billy should have to step in and save Marion from. Marion's a big girl. She can handle it herself, right?
You've taken my pride, you scrapped my rocket dojo, laid waste to my laboratory, broke my televisions, and murdered countless Williamses. All I wanted was a date. This ends now!
So Mr. I've Never Heard of eHarmony apparently kidnapped Marion to get laid. That would explain Evil Marion's metallic bikini. In all seriousness, if Billy hadn't stepped in to save Marion, she would have become the personal fuck toy for a blatant Skeletor parody. That might explain why Double Dragon Neon ends with Marion punching Skullmageddon square in the dick.
I'll return one day to antagonize you, Billy and Jimmy!
After all, what better way to teach men not to rape than punching them in the dick for attempting to do such a thing could you possibly manifest? All jokes aside, the point is that saving Mary couldn't possibly be offensive in real life when you consider the more realistic consequences for not saving her. See, this is exactly what I was talking about near the beginning of the video. All these damsels have their humanity stolen from the antagonist, not the protagonist, and are subjected to either death or rape as a result. At least that's what most likely to happen to them if these stories took place in real life. Considering how much of an issue these things actually are in our world, just check the statistics I mentioned earlier, it's insanely irrational for any of the main characters in these stories to just walk away and let the damsel's ordeal be her own just because it encourages a stereotype that arguably isn't a stereotype at all, given how biology supports the idea that having an average woman defend herself against an average man is just straight up ridiculous. I know some of you see that as patronizing and paternalistic just like Anita does, but the truth is that men are stronger than women on average. There are studies backing this up. This is not a socially constructed myth by any means, so based off this information, there should be no mystery as to why women are victimized more so than men in real life, just like there should be no mystery as to why action heroes are usually male and the captives of the villains are usually female. That and, well...
Only 3% of open source programmers are women, and only 11.5% of video game developers are women.
Anyway, Damsels in Distress are more or less a reflection of real-life differences in victimization rates. If that's somehow sexist, then it sure as fuck wasn't the fault of video games. You can't blame the media for real-life sexism that existed before those media outlets existed. That's like blaming the Call of Duty franchise for the events that led to World War II. Hell, not even Birth of a Nation can be blamed for outright causing racism. The racism existed before the movie was made. It's almost like racism is what caused that movie to exist as opposed to the other way around. This brings us to Anita's claim that these games have larger ramifications on our cultural ecosystem. Of course, she doesn't elaborate on what this actually means or even hint towards what these ramifications actually are. It doesn't help that there are no studies supporting the idea that sexism in the media has any real impact on how real people actually behave. Oddly enough, such ramifications have been talked about before. A documentary by the name of Misrepresentation, Miss as in Mrs. Insert Surname, was basically an hour and a half documentation of sexism in the media in general and displayed how it affects people's views on women. It really didn't have any facts to back itself up either, but at least it gives viewers some good talking points as the documentary included interviews and professional opinions from people with actual fucking PhDs. What does this have to do with Anita's video? Well, Anita is basically trying to do the same thing, except that without interviews with actual game developers or at least some peer-reviewed studies to back up her claims that these games have ramifications of any kind, the whole video just boils down to her own interpretation. That's fine in itself. She's allowed to have an opinion. The problem is that she is asserting that video games should change their representation of women without giving developers a reason beyond her simply being offended by content that not even all women find offensive. Based off of Anita's previous ranting on this subject, seeing at how the point she is trying to make is the same thing she said in her Women in Refrigerators video. She wants more female protagonists that are depicted as being just as powerful as men. This is obviously the point behind showing how male characters escape on their own accord when kidnapped in her montage of typical male heroes.
Let's compare the damsel to the archetypal hero myth, in which a typically male character may occasionally also be harmed, incapacitated, or briefly imprisoned at some point during their journey. In these situations, the character relies on their intelligence, cunning, and skill to engineer their own escape.
That's better.
Or, just punching a hole in the prison wall works too. The point is, they're ultimately able to gain back their own freedom. In fact, that process of overcoming the ordeal is an important step in the protagonist's transformation into a heroic figure. A damseled woman, on the other hand, is shown as incapable of escaping the predicament on her own, and then must wait for a savior to come and do it for her. In this way, the damsel's ordeal is not her own. Instead, it's framed as a trial for the hero to overcome. Consequently, the trope robs women in peril from the opportunity of being the architects of their own escape, and therefore prevents them from becoming archetypal heroes themselves.
However, she fails to understand that this has nothing to do with the player being male. This has everything to do with characters like Star Fox, Snake, and Link being, the main fucking character. This is why when the main character is female, like Lara Croft for example, they're also shown as being capable of making their own escape. Again, due to this subject-object dichotomy, everything that isn't you is an object. The perils of other characters are meant to give the player incentives for their actions. Actually kind of funny, as Anita points out herself, that the damsel's entrapment is meant to be a trial for the hero to overcome. This is exactly what the trope itself is really about. The damsel in distress trope, along with the save the princess variant, are described by TV tropes, most likely Anita's main source of information, as being excuse plot tropes. This means that the damsel, the antagonist, and everything else in the game is rather redundant because they're only there to serve as context for the player's actions in order to prevent them from feeling completely pointless.
Remember Pauline, damsel of the classic Donkey Kong arcade? Well, she's also been revived, first in 1994's Donkey Kong for the Game Boy, and later in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series for the Nintendo DS. Each game features a rehashing of the old excuse plot, with Pauline being whisked away by the giant ape during the opening credits.
So yeah, it's just an excuse to have something to do. Really, the only way to avoid perpetuating this allegedly harmful stereotype is to add more variety to both protagonists and captives. Yet, as I already mentioned, there's no real evidence that these games have any real impact on how the player interprets gender relations in real life. So really, why bother? Saving Natalie and the professor as Spike didn't impact my views of women and elderly men. Really, these ramifications sound more like a guise for what Anita actually wants developers to do, and that's to simply make more female lead characters. A lot of what Anita says in her video sounds like a girl trying to force her way into a boys club, and it's hard not to get that kind of vibe from a woman who literally used the phrase boys club to describe the tech industry during that Donglegate shit. Going by Anita's logic about objectification, you basically can't be allowed to save anyone because you're apparently only doing it to reclaim your stolen property. So in the latest Tomb Raider reboot, when Laura has to save her friend Sam from having her body become a studio apartment for the malicious Sun Queen, this is just Laura reclaiming her stolen property, right? Sam is being disempowered for the benefit of Laura's story arc, so a woman is being objectified so another woman can be empowered.
O great queen, through the trials I have brought you the vessels. Pour forth and return to this mortal toil. Pour forth and be reborn. Pour forth and awaken.
Soldier screaming, "Protect the Sun Queen!" as if you couldn't have any female opponents to shoot at. Women must be really weekend and capable if they're shooting down hordes of male soldiers trying to kill them. Well, her, as Laura, is apparently a one-woman army. See, this scene in itself shows that Laura is more than capable of protecting herself, and from men no less, but Sam, on the other hand, is in a state of helplessness. She can't realistically be expected to help herself, so Laura saves her instead. Is it still objectification when a woman saves another woman, or is this one of those "it's only sexist when men do it" moments? In all seriousness, in Kaya Dark Lineage, Kaya has to save her kidnapped brother from being turned into a wolfen. Frank isn't in a position to save himself, so Kaya comes to his rescue. Is this depicting men as weak and incapable, or is this, I don't know, just depicting that Frank needs some fucking help? Oh, and let's not forget Beyond Good and Evil, where Jade had to rescue Double H from basically being a vegetable. He was kind of frozen in place too. You know, kind of like Crystal. The problem with Anita's argument is that, when you get right down to it, it's based solely on preconceived notions of male players and a strict, blatantly gender-biased usage of the damsel in distress trope. Her argument is basically that since this trope happens X amount of times too often, a message is being sent to the player about women that can be harmful in real life, because no one who plays New Super Mario Bros. U will ever get their hands on the Tomb Raider 2013 reboot, so obviously the quantity of games using a trope that hasn't been proven to affect anyone more so than parenting and overall life experiences must be an issue. I'm going to be brutally honest here. I totally agree with Anita and the like that there should be more female lead characters in games. That's why I usually main female characters in fighting games. However, I see no ramifications from a lack of female representation in games that isn't really there to begin with. I'm not going to waste even more time listing them all, but there have been more than enough games with female heroes ranging from Alicia Dragoon to American McGee's Alice that this notion that too many people in the gaming industry and gaming community view women as being generally weak and incapable just sounds like shit that Anita is projecting onto others, with the games mentioned in her video serving as a frankly bullshit justification for making these projections. Now, I can respect that Anita has a different interpretation of the messages, if any, being sent through the games. She's totally entitled to her opinion. However, you shouldn't need $6,000 to express an opinion, especially when a lot of the people who donated honestly thought something in the gaming industry needed to be changed. It doesn't help that Anita is basically repeating the same old shit she's been saying for 3 whole fucking years. You know, with upcoming games like Remember Me, who really thinks women are weak and incapable? It certainly isn't the folks behind the new Defiance game.
Rated M for mature.
With women being in fighting games, action games, and even shooters, how could one hope to solidify the idea that women are weak and incapable when games like Perfect Dark and the Donkey Kong Country sequels contradict the message? Let's be honest with ourselves. Anita's argument is just a bad case of feminist-flavored tunnel vision, and the implications that the player sees all women in trouble as objects might actually be a little insulting depending on how sensitive you are. If you need any more evidence that Anita's video on Damsels in Distress is based on ideology rather than context, just look at the list of games on the Feminist Frequency website for this video. One of the listed examples pretty much proves that Anita's point is to simply tell developers to never have their female characters kidnapped. You see, Talia, Vicky, and Dr. Baker from Batman Arkham City somehow managed to get on this list. Those of you familiar with this game already know what's wrong here, but I'll break it down for everyone. You see, in Batman Arkham City, you play as Batman. What does Batman do? Why, save people, of course. Oh, but he doesn't just save anybody. Oh no. You see, Batman saves everybody. As in, this game has captives of both fucking sexes that get held hostage, and he has to save police officers and just people walking down the damn street that happen to occasionally be male. So let me get this straight. It's okay to beat up thugs that are mostly male, aside from the fucking ninjas, and save people from getting killed as long as those captives are never female? Let's just ignore the fact that the player can play as Catwoman. Let's ignore the fact that Catwoman saves Batman's ass near the end of the game. Let's ignore the fact that Commissioner Gordon found his ass in this same scenario in Arkham Asylum. Since a minor character and 2 rather meaningless supporting characters who happen to be female get captured, the folks behind Arkham City apparently view women as weak and incapable. Sorry, but that's just straight up horseshit. It's like the context of the narrative Anita is weaving changes the minute the gender of the heroes and the captives change. But this couldn't possibly be the case, right?
I just want you for my very own, more than you could ever know. Make my wish come true, all I want for Christmas is you. The singer expresses no desire, needs, or interests in anything other than being gifted a man for Christmas. While most covers of this song are done by women such as Shania Twain, Miley Cyrus, and Mercedes from Glee, it's not any less creepy when a man sings it because the lyrics could be interpreted as bordering on stalker territory. Here are some other things that you might want for Christmas in addition to romance. Quality time with friends and family, days off for relaxation, good homemade food, or an 11-inch cast zinc life-size replica of Buffy's Slayer scythe, complete with authentic ostrich skin wrapped handcrafted wooden handle. Just an idea.
You know what? I think I've made my point. We're not only talking about a woman who finds sexism in fucking Christmas songs, but also views the songs differently based on the gender of the singer, then it's pretty safe to say that objectivity has nothing to do with the conversation anymore. Oh, and I love how Anita suggests that instead of a man, because men can't be friends and family, that the woman singing the song asks for a scythe from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. A scythe being a literal object, so now we're replacing men with objects. I really hope that those of you who donated are truly happy with what you received. I really do, because I can't help but feel like you all got fucked over. And before anyone who says, oh, well, what about part 2, you dumb fuck? Wait for part 2, you fucking idiot. Let me tell you that you don't need to be a member of the X-Men to know what's going to happen in part 2. For starters, I'm 99.9% sure she'll mention Rayman Origins. I mean, it was in the fucking trailer for this hot mess of a series, you know, the same trailer with that crop picture of Ophelia from Scargirls that hides the fact that Peacock is a character that exists. Regarding Rayman Origins, she'll complain about the nymphs you have to save and how them being hypersexualized is a form of objectification. Fuck the fact that they're nymphs and are supposed to look like that. Anyway, unless she plans to add something beyond saying the same shit with more recent games as examples, that little tangent will be about how Petulia and the rest of the nymphs are being disempowered for the sake of giving the male hero Rayman something to do. Oh, and she'll complain about how the nymphs shake their big boobies and big booties in order to grant you powers when you save them. Not much else you could possibly hear about that topic. Of course, Dante's Inferno will be talked about, and some other games like Infamous may make the cut. The point will still essentially be the same unless Anita plans to actually prove the Damsel in Distress trope actually has any ramifications of any kind. Lastly, there's the games that flip the script on the damsel. She shows a picture of Elaine Marley Threepwood from the Monkey Island series to preview this topic. Really, if you're familiar with Monkey Island, you know what this will be about. See, Elaine gets kidnapped in almost every Monkey Island game, but the catch is that she usually ends up freeing herself. There's already a name for this shit. TV Tropes calls it the badass damsel. So basically, Elaine would be considered a good usage of the damsel in distress trope because she doesn't have to rely on Guybrush to help her escape from LeChuck most of the time. In fact, Elaine plays a crucial part in the series as more of a partner to Guybrush as opposed to being nothing but a love interest who sits on the sidelines. And you know what? That's fucking fantastic. Morgan Le Fay is a pretty good female character too. You want to know why none of this is surprising? For starters, Elaine being kidnapped or put into some other form of distress is played off as more of a joke in this series. That's to say that Elaine being the badass damsel is a parody of the damsel in distress trope itself. Kind of like how Princess Daphne in Dragon's Lair is meant to be a satirical take on the save the princess trope seen in so many of those old ass Disney movies, which Anita seems to take seriously. That, or she is again ignoring the context of how the trope is actually being used. Anyway, another distinct trait of the Monkey Island series is that it has an actual fucking story. And I don't mean one that is told in a matter of 10 seconds like most games from the 80s and early 90s. The plot is essentially the game itself, as Monkey Island is a point-and-click adventure game. The main character, Guybrush, isn't your typical hyper-masculine meathead. He's quirky, comedic, and has just enough flaws to make him human while still being a hero. Basically, he's the kind of character you'll rarely see in video games these days, where every other male character is either on steroids or covered in Space Marine armor. So really, it should come as no surprise that the game that actually attempted to be creative and, you know, have an actual fucking plot ended up with great characters, but both male and female. if we bother to acknowledge that most of Anita's examples are of games with bullshit storylines, we might actually come to the conclusion that the saturation of this trope is most likely due to flat-out bad writing. Considering all the projections and ramifications Anita talks about, it's important to keep in mind what was actually going through most developers' heads when making these games revolve around damsel in distress tropes. It really is one of the easiest tropes to fall back on when you have limited resources for storytelling, hence why so many modern games barely touch this trope. So when considering that part 2 of Anita's video on this trope only states that she'll look into more recent examples like Sonic the Hedgehog 2006, that god-awful Sonic title where a woman's cries lead to the end of the world, and looking at variants of the badass damsel trope that may include Zia, or Zaya, or however her name is pronounced, from Bastion and other badass damsels, it's hard to think of any real reason to stay tuned for more of Anita's opinionated drivel. There's literally nothing left to talk about unless she wants to talk to developers directly or interview gamers to see how they interpret the trope along with how they view both genders. After all, the goal, so to speak, was to reduce sexism in the gaming community by reducing sexism in games. Yet Anita has failed to show a cohesive correlation between the community and the games. So really, what's the fucking point? Her argument literally boils down to, I'm offended by your artwork, now censor your artwork. What's truly sad is that if Anita had pumped her energy into making her own game, or at least helping women who want to get into the gaming industry achieve their dreams, she might have actually made a point about women's independence by seeking to solve a perceived problem on her own. Instead, she gives us nearly 25 minutes worth of pissing in the wind that's ultimately about telling men how to fix a problem she has with gaming for her. I think Anita sums up her own video quite nicely.
I haven't said anything.
So really, what did we learn today from Anita's unrivaled intellect? Well, we learned that all men view women in peril as their stolen property. We learned that damsels represent all women's capabilities. We learned that men should never save women as it is apparently a form of objectification. We learned that all men, even as young boys, fantasize about power, and saving helpless women is just another way for men to engage in their inherent desire for power trips. We learned that women never save men because Anita never addresses the trope outside of the game of patriarchy context. And lastly, but certainly not least, we learned to always have female characters be the leads in video games, as they can never be shown as objects as according to the subject-object dichotomy. So all you future game developers writing stories revolving around male lead characters better stop what you're doing right now. Why? Because fuck men. Seriously though, Anita's video isn't bad because she's a woman. Her video isn't bad because she's a feminist, though being a feminist sure as fuck doesn't help. Her video is bad because she literally presents an argument lacking any critical analysis that is based heavily on rhetoric and blatant assumptions that come dangerously close to being sexist themselves, since she basically tells her viewers that women should never need saving and that men have possessive ambitions for helping women who should never need to be saved. If any of this is a misinterpretation on my part, I honestly don't see why I should even feel sorry at this point, as any misunderstandings between Anita and her viewers could have been addressed if the comments on the video were open. And before anyone says, what about all the trolls who bully her, you dumbass? May I remind you all that YouTube now supports a common approval system that Anita could have easily used to filter out trolls just like she did in her past videos. There's really no good excuse for anyone claiming to be making an academic presentation to literally block off communications with the audience unless Anita wants to create a Thunderdome where only her voice is heard. It's like a professor kicking out any student who dares to question their thesis. Ultimately, no one learns anything because only the people who already agree, which are the backers of this project in this example, are the only ones who get to say anything. Or at least that would be the case if comments or video responses of any kind were allowed on the video. I'm not going to even bother to question whether or not Anita is afraid of criticism. The fact that she obviously doesn't want her work criticized in any way is bad enough on its own. I hope you backers are truly satisfied. I really do, because this video really is just women in refrigerators reworded into a 25-minute smearing of gaming history. Speaking of recaps, let's look at Anita's upcoming tropes and take a wild guess as to what those will most likely be about. Let's get the least laughable one out the way first. The fighting fuck toy is pretty damn obvious. It's going to be about sexual objectification and how characters like Ivy from Soul Calibur fighting other scantily dressed women is basically the video game equivalent to watching a mud wrestling match. This is easily the best one out of all of them because the difference between sexual objectification and sexualization is an interesting topic if you can enter it with an open mind. However, I have a bad feeling that characters like Morrigan Ashland from Darkstalkers will get grouped with the Zakus from Strash Paddock. This really depends on how Anita views sexualization and sexual objectification, assuming she even sees a clear difference. Having Valentine from Skullgirls on the promotional poster for this shit sends the message that she really doesn't see a difference. Then there's the man with boobs trope, which is yet another retread. Watch her video on Sucker Punch. She basically states her case on this trope in that video. Oddly enough, challenging the man with boobs trope encourages gender stereotypes by drawing a line between male and female character traits. You can't complain about women being depicted as natural caregivers if anything outside of that is acting like a man or any other variant of gender identification. The sexy sidekick is more or less a variant on Manic Pixie Dream Girl, so if you've watched that, you've got a good idea what this one is about. The sexy villainess is just the evil demon seductress again, and will most likely use Poison Ivy from Arkham Asylum as an example. Again. Women as background decoration. You know what? That one might be interesting simply due to the fact that this is even considered offensive. I mean, what in utter fuck is this trope even about? What's offensive about it? Because women are being objectified and left out of the action? Sounds like Damsels in Distress all over again. The voodoo priestess / tribal sorceress trope isn't too much of a recap, but it'll most likely be more about racism than sexism, so it shouldn't even be on there. Women as reward is literally Damsels in Distress again, so let's just skip this shit. Mrs. Male character is literally man with boobs again, unless she's going to talk about how certain female characters are extensions of male characters as opposed to being their own characters. Think how Supergirl is to Superman. Fuck Wonder Woman, she doesn't exist. Unattractive equals evil will basically be about characters like Grunty from Banjo-Kazooie and how games depict ugly female characters as being inherently bad because they're ugly. It's the same shit I hear from people complaining about Ursula in The Little Mermaid. Oddly enough, this contradicts sexy villainess because the female villain can no longer be ugly or attractive. Lastly, she'll finally talk about positive female characters and make it sound like these characters are rare when they fucking aren't. Oh, and she threw in top 10 most common defenses for sexism in games, which will most likely be about criticism she's already tried and failed to address properly. So there you have it. To all you backers of this project, this is most likely going to be the future of this series, assuming it has a future at all, as it has been over a month and Anita still hasn't completed her thoughts on Damsels in Distress. Why part 2 wasn't already finished by now will be a mystery to me, but at least it gives us all us naysayers more than enough time to respond to this garbage. Yes, I said garbage because you don't take nearly $160,000 to make videos about video games just to end up repeating yourself and contradicting yourself, all while avoiding any critical analysis of the contents of the games or the effects of the trope on the player's views on women. Anita's entire video, hell, her entire project, is based solely on her own ideologies. I'm not knocking her for having an opinion, but all this little charade is going to do is make it impossible for people to take the discussion about sexism in gaming seriously for the next couple of years. Anita is only going to make it harder for women in general to be taken seriously in the gaming industry. If that's what you want, then go ahead and keep supporting this woman. I honestly don't care. However, Anita nor anyone else is going to go after the gaming industry with their rhetorical rhetorical ramblings and not expect any criticism. That's not to say Anita deserved the harassment she received, but neither did Jack Thompson. That didn't stop him from not knowing jack shit about video games, and that certainly isn't stopping Anita from knowing just as much as Jack did, which is jack shit. Before anyone asks, why do you care what Anita says? The answer to that is because video games and gamers are already scrutinized for shit that doesn't really apply to them as a collective. You can try to argue the same about feminists, though you'd have a much harder time proving the point. Anyway, gamers have been depicted as antisocial and prone to violence more than enough times for us to have our own stereotypes to worry about. Whether or not this is really who we are is something the community itself needs to address. However, we don't need misogynistic stereotypes layered upon the already existing gamer stereotypes. I don't know about you, but I don't think the gaming community as a whole needs to take the fall for 4chan trolls being 4chan trolls. More importantly, people unfamiliar with the gaming community and video games in general won't benefit from Anita's misinformation about video game content. This isn't a war of any kind, by the way. We don't need to fight Anita or anything like that. Like with any false accusation, gaming culture needs to stand up for itself, and that includes addressing the arguments people like Anita make and proving them wrong. After all, she should have a voice, and so should we. Besides, her work can only be improved based off of constructive criticism, so as far as I'm concerned, I'm doing her a favor. Anyway, I think I've ranted about this woman long enough. Feel free to share this video or even mirror it in case it ever gets taken down. If you have any objectification, because we kept talking about justification so much. If you have any objections to anything I said in this video, comments and video responses are allowed for this very reason. Also, remember to check the description for links and sources used. With that being said, let's hope Damsels in Distress Part 2 isn't as easy to tear apart as Part 1 obviously was. I know the whole save the princess trope can be considered a form of benevolent sexism, but I didn't really know how to fit that topic into the context of this video. I figured that's basically the form of sexism being talked about in Anita's video, so there was no point in specifying that. Whether or not benevolent sexism is worth talking about is a whole nother debate in itself, though if articles on the topic are any indication, that subject really isn't worth touching based on the fact that the facts of benevolent sexism and benevolent sexism itself are never really connected, at least not in the articles I've read on the subject. Feel free to counter this if you have anything to add. Also, I would like to add on to that for anyone who managed to reach this far into the video, and the part I'm doing right now is completely unscripted, so excuse me if I stutter or anything like that. I'm not going to go back and re-record the whole thing just to get those out, but I'm fully aware that part 2 and 3 have already came out, and I have also already watched part 2 and 3 of the Damsel in Distress trope videos that Anita Sarkeesian produced, and I could feasibly make responses to part 2 and 3 if you guys decided that you actually like this video and you wanted to hear my take on part 2 and 3. But I can't really think much I could say about part 2 and 3 that hasn't been said in the video I just made right now. And the reason I say that is because in part 2 she kind of talks about how saving women from death and rape apparently encourages men to beat their wives or some shit, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, I could try to talk about that, but I really don't think there's that much there to talk about, because most of the stuff she talks about in 2, and especially the third video, it really is already addressed in the response I made to the first video. The only thing I could possibly add is that she really is dragging the context of the whole saving women from being ruined, so to speak, thing, the whole rape thing. She's taking that out of context, because the thing about part 2 is that she implies that since the cultural context of a ruined woman, a woman gets raped, so therefore she's ruined and was sometimes punished with death because of that. In ancient times, where it was ass backwards and had no idea what benevolence apparently was. But back then they would do shit like that for a woman who got raped, and it was considered like a violation of property rights or something. I mean, it was a little bit deeper than that, but it was definitely pretty ass backwards, especially if you're talking about 10th, 11th century stuff like that. and she apparently tries to correlate women being turned into monsters or being possessed by dark forces as an equivalent to being a part of this ruined woman pastime that no longer applies to modern day context, and that's just silliness. So I could go into that, but I couldn't make it as long as this video, which is probably a good thing because this video is really long anyway. But as far as to why it took me so long to make this, it took me 4 months to make this video. It took me about 2 months to actually write the transcript for the video. You know, have basically my script laid out and do the research for it, because I also had to do that and juggle school at the same time. There were some days I just didn't feel like working on it because I'm still kind of shy about posting shit, especially with my voicing it on the internet, so I had to get over that. But the thing is that my computer, my hard drive, not the hard drive, the entire tower that had the information for this video in it, it crashed. Like the whole thing broke. So I wasn't able to finish recording because I already gotten everything written down. I just didn't do the recording part of the video. So I had to get the computer fixed, which took nearly 2 months to do. And when I finally got it fixed, then I was able to record it. And that took a long time too. So I just wanted to specify that I do in fact know the other videos exist. You know, it's just that this video, the content of this video is 4 months old. So it is behind everybody else's responses. But, you know, I mentioned like, the upcoming Remember Me game, the upcoming Defiance game, as if they're new games. They're not new games because they already came out. But, you know, I do know that. I just wanted to let you guys know that. So anyway, if you like this video, I can make, you know, the responses to the other 2 videos. But if not, I probably won't consider doing that because there isn't that much to be talked about. But feel free to share your thoughts, post those comments, those video responses, so we can have an actual discussion going on here. Because if we're going to talk about sexism in video games, we need to talk about sexism in video games so we can just get it over with and be done with the subject. I'm tired of talking about this shit, so let's have a conversation to be done with it. So I want to hopefully provoke some kind of thought process in most people watching this video and get them talking about the subject constructively, and to please refrain from any type of, you know, harassment or attacks aimed at Anita, because again, it's not about trying to fight Anita. We're trying to prove to Anita that she's wrong about us as a gaming community. Alright, see ya.